Welcome and thank you all for joining us today at our hearing, which is entitled The State of the Cftc. And after opening remarks, members will receive testimony from our witness today, and then the hearing will be open for questions. So I want to say to you, Chairman Rustin Bingham, congratulations on your appointment to this great, important, and powerful position as chairman of our CFTC. Good to have you here. And for those watching at home, I'd like to kind of share with you the important role of the CFTC and for all that it is doing historically. It was first brought in a bill to us, and then it became its own independent entity. First, of course, you were with the USDA, and now we've done that. And it's so good to have you. After brief opening remarks, as I said, our witnesses will begin. And for those of you who are watching on TV, I'd like to provide you with a little bit of background, as I said, and let you know what a great moment this is for us. I do want to say this, that I want to come into this meeting with you understanding me as chairman of our Agriculture Committee. I want you to know that, first of all, I'm a graduate of our prestigious Wharton School of Finance, where I got my MBA. And I'm saying this to you because since I've been in Congress, I have been, shall we say, the protector of our great financial system. I also served on the executive board of directors of the Wharton School of Finance for a number of years. And also, in coming here, in the 20 years that I have been here, one of my foremost protective missions was for the CFTC. And I hope you understand what I'm saying, because I have such a great love and affection for our great financial system. And nowhere was that manifested when I had to stand up against the European Union when they wanted to take away the CFTC's right to regulate our cross-border clearinghouses. It was I and ranking member, I think it was Mike Conaway and Austin Scott. We all got together and we told the European Union, hell no, you're not going to come and regulate any of our financial institutions. And so this is why this is important to me. I served on the House Agriculture Committee for 20 years, 10 of those as chairman of the subcommittee on commodities and the exchanges and futures, as well as energy and credit. Again, that gives me that credential. And even at the Wharton School, I was the one that premiered and put together the major thesis talking points on the great Alexander Hamilton. So I'm just sharing that with you because I want you to understand my concern that I have with this cryptocurrency situation. I will be getting into that during our question and answer period, but I wanted you to know of my background and my love and affection for our great financial system. We've got the greatest financial system in the world. And as I said, brought to us by none other than Alexander Hamilton. And I'm sure you know the story. With that, Ranking Member, I'll turn it over to you for any comments you have.
Sure. Thank you, Chairman. Much appreciated. Chairman Benham, welcome. It is a pleasure to see you again and to have you before a committee today to discuss the current state of the CFTC and your plans for the coming year. I want to begin by congratulating you on your unanimous confirmation. Well done, which was a significant vote of confidence in you and for the Commission's work. You have important responsibilities before you, and we look forward to working with you and ensuring you have the tools to carry out the mandates that we vested with the Commission. I'd also like to congratulate you on the 4 nominees to the Commission, Ms. Christy Romero, Ms. Kristen Johnson, Ms. Summer Mersinger, and Ms. Carolyn Pham, who were officially confirmed earlier this week and will be joining you soon. The Commission works best when there's a full slate of commissioners, and I'm pleased that that's where we're at, and I'm looking forward to that certainly in the coming weeks. Finally, I want to offer a heartfelt thanks to Commissioner Dawn Stump as she departs the Commission. Throughout her time in this role, I've always appreciated her engagement and her thoughtful approach to the issues. Our nation is better for her service. Chairman Benham, you could not be appearing before the committee at a more consequential time. There's so much to discuss. 2 issues stand out for me. First, the war in Ukraine, which has brought misery to the Ukrainian people, but its effects are not isolated to Central Europe. Putin's reckless crimes have roiled commodity markets, impacting agricultural, energy, metal, and credit markets throughout the world. The efficient and effective operation of our commodity derivative markets under the watchful eye of CFTC plays a pivotal role in helping end users navigate these turbulent times. Second, I'm heartened by your calls to expand the CFTC's oversight of the digital commodity markets. As you know, I've been hard at work on the Digital Commodity Exchange Act legislation, which provides the CFTC with jurisdiction over the digital commodity spot markets. And as we consider further regulations to protect consumers engaged with crypto trading venues, it is essential we do so in a manner that promotes innovation. CFTC is well poised to play a leading role in this effort. Also wanted to touch very briefly on the Commission's recent request for comment on FTX's proposal to amend its derivatives clearing organization registration order. And thank you for putting this out for public comment, very transparent way. This request presents a number of novel questions to the Commission to consider. It holds the promise of lower cost markets and lower cost market participants and reducing in risk through the clearing system, but also raises significant issues regarding market structures and risk mitigation that should be explored frankly and publicly. And I commend you for seeking the input of market professionals and the public as a part of your consideration of the request. One key characteristic of the Commodity Exchange Act is the flexibility it provides under its core principles for businesses to experiment and to innovate new ways to meet longstanding regulatory goals. It is through the consistent application of these core principles that our markets and financial markets have become leaders in innovation across the globe. Now, this proposal, like all proposals that come before the Commission, should be measured against those core principles that CFTC has actually become well known for. Now, I look forward to a meaningful, substantive, and importantly, public debate about both safety and innovation in our markets, so American derivatives markets will remain the most liquid, most efficient, and most productive markets in the world. Chairman Benham, I really look forward to your comments today, and thank you for joining us, and thank you, Chairman, for this opportunity today. And with that, I yield back.
The Chair would request that other members submit their opening statements for the record so Chairman Benham may begin his testimony and to ensure that there is ample time for questions. Our witness today is the Chairman of the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, Mr. Rostin Benham. Chairman Benham, we welcome you to the House Agriculture Committee, and Chairman Benham, please Begin when you're ready.
Thank you, Chairman Scott and Ranking Member, for those comments. Before I begin, Chairman, I appreciate your comments earlier. And quite frankly, we are lucky to have you in the role you are right now and given the experience you have. So we appreciate that wholeheartedly from the CFTC's perspective and look forward to working with you in your role as chair. Good morning, Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Thompson, and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the state of the CFTC and provide an overview of current priorities. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge my colleague and friend, Commissioner Dawn Stump, for her tireless service and dedication to the agency. I also want to thank agency staff. And finally, I do want to wish to congratulate and welcome Christy Goldsmith-Romero, Kristen Johnson, Summer Mersinger, and Caroline Pham, who, as Ranking Member Thompson noted, were recently confirmed earlier this week. As the agency continues transitioning away from and considering life after the pandemic, we are witnessing transformative change throughout our industry and the markets that we oversee. During this time of transition, I am committed to collaboration and careful deliberation among our core of new commissioners, with stakeholders and our regulatory peers as we address new and emerging risks and opportunities. Under my leadership, the CFTC will exercise utmost care, patience, and diligence as we move forward on critical decision points. However, this ongoing transformation will not distract the CFTC from staying true to its historic responsibilities and ensuring America's farmers, ranchers, manufacturers, and other commercial end users continue to have cost-effective access to CFTC-regulated markets in order to manage risk. The derivatives industry's population is shifting, having increasingly emerged from the technology sector rather than traditional finance. We are also seeing an influx of retail participants empowered by information and technology. As a core purpose of the Commodity Exchange Act is the promotion of responsible innovation and fair competition, the agency will continue to provide a steady hand as we make decisions that will impact our markets and the larger economy in the years ahead. Before I move to our agency priorities, I'd like to take a moment to provide a high-level overview of the CFTC's response to and our observations regarding the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. The CFTC is on heightened alert with respect to market functionality and resilience and fortifying the agency against cyber attacks. Prior to the invasion and in anticipation of the possible implementation of sanctions, I worked directly with the Treasury Department to ensure that general licenses would be available where appropriate, and CFTC staff are in routine contact with exchanges as sanctions and related volatility may alter affected index, currency, and physical commodity settlements. As the invasion became a reality, the ongoing tragedy in Ukraine has sparked extreme volatility, with key markets exhibiting 20% higher volatility as compared to that observed prior to the invasion. By and large, the U.S. futures markets have remained orderly through periods of high prices and extreme volatility, consistently demonstrating strong correlation between futures and cash prices, and good convergence towards contract expiration. To date, the CFTC has observed a relative balance in buying and selling, indicating that trading has not been panic-driven. And despite episodic spikes in trading volume by as much as 2 times normal level, markets have been able to clear the volumes without significant market disruption. CFTC surveillance staff are closely examining trading activity for manipulative, inappropriate, or disruptive conduct. Commission staff in the divisions of market oversight, clearing and risk, and market participants are actively monitoring compliance by exchanges, self-regulatory organizations, and intermediaries for trade processing, execution, and clearing. CFTC staff are using every tool the agency has to ensure that commodity markets continue to fairly and transparently serve the intended price discovery and risk management function, and this includes monitoring for excessive speculation. With the benefit of hindsight and real-time market experience, a top priority of my chairmanship will be the active review of the agency's Dodd-Frank rulemakings, ensuring they remain fit for purpose as Congress intended. The market turmoil related to the global pandemic tested the resiliency of the derivatives markets and post-crisis reforms. In fact, volatility in the global financial markets during March and April of 2020 and the current volatility linked to geopolitical issues continue to raise challenges related to liquidity and margin requirements. This fuels active debate on the need for additional tools and resources to manage risks, including collateral management. Through all of these events, U.S. central counterparties remain strong and among the strongest in the world. Nonetheless, given the role of central clearing as a critical tool in mitigating systemic risk in global financial markets, the Commission expects to grow its stress testing program to help ensure resilience in absorbing both market and systemic shocks in the future. The Commission will continue working with our international counterparts. We will advance thoughtful policy, encourage a collaborative approach that supports strong and transparent regulation and preserves the primacy of home country jurisdiction, while discouraging the appeal of racing to the regulatory bottom. The effectiveness of the CFTC's Division of Enforcement in holding individuals and institutions accountable promotes confidence in U.S. derivatives markets. DOE will prioritize the use of cutting-edge investigative and analytical techniques and assert the CFTC's fraud and manipulation jurisdiction where doing so preserves market integrity and protects the public. A part of the enforcement program's success is rooted in its whistleblower program. I am grateful to this committee's longstanding support of the whistleblower program and continue to stand ready to ensure its long-term success. The CFTC's enforcement program is only as good as the tools we have to identify bad actors. To further support DOE's efforts, I have directed our Division of Data to transform the agency's analytics toolkit to leverage the cloud architecture with advancements in artificial intelligence, machine learning, and data analytics. Recent market events highlights the increasing concerns for potential cyber attacks against American critical infrastructure, including U.S. financial markets. To that end, I have directed staff in the Market Participants Division to develop policy to address system safeguards for futures commissions merchants, swap dealers, and major swap participants, further fortifying CFTC markets from an attack by adding to the suite of system safeguards that are currently in place. As the CFTC and the derivatives and larger financial industry accelerate towards migration to cloud technologies, we are also mindful of the potential risks as we look forward to exploring those benefits. President Biden's executive order on ensuring responsible development in digital assets acknowledges that the growth and widespread adoption of digital assets presents novel issues for all regulators. The CFTC will continue its proactive approach in using our existing enforcement authority in the digital asset commodity space to protect customers and markets from fraud and manipulation. I look forward to coordinating with fellow agencies as outlined in the executive order and with members of this committee on these important issues. Turning to another area of increasing coordination, just over a year ago, I announced the creation of the Climate Risk Unit to focus on the role of derivatives in understanding, pricing, and mitigating climate-related risk, and supporting the orderly transition to a low-carbon economy through market-based initiatives. And finally, as one of my first official actions as chairman, I announced the hiring of the agency's first chief diversity officer to provide leadership and executive direction on the Commission's efforts to integrate DEIA into every aspect of our talent and business operations. Despite uncertain times and great market volatility, I'm optimistic and confident that the CFTC will be able to meet the demands of the public and the markets that we serve. In closing, I wish to thank the committee for its continued support. We will always be judicious with our resources, grateful for the privilege we have to serve, and request additional funds when needed to meet the growing demands of the agency and its markets. Thank you, Chairman, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Chairman Bingham, thank you. Thank you very much for your important and very significant and timely testimony. At this time, members will be recognized for questions in order of seniority, alternating between majority and minority members. You will be recognized for 5 minutes each in order to allow us to get to as many questions as possible. And as always, please keep your microphones muted until you are recognized in order to minimize any background noise. Chairman Bingham, I recognize myself for the first 5 minutes. And as I mentioned to you, my deep love and affection for our financial system, I believe I'm in this place at the right time to do good work. And I called to your attention immediately, just to give you an example. I referred to what the leadership on this committee, both Democrats and Republicans, have done. But let me just give you an example going back to our derivatives, our cross-border, our clearinghouses. That's not that. But when Great Britain moved finally got their Brexit, you know what they wanted to do to us? Because we were Great Britain's equivalency partner, they said, well, hey, let's put the United States in third country. I hated that right there. We are, if nothing more than a first country. And I found out what third country was. But here's the point I'm making. The reason that they went around in Europe and to others and said we need to do that is because this Congress has failed to reauthorize the CFTC for almost 12 years now. That's a weakness. We need to change that. And we are going to move to change it, to reauthorize it, because people will say, well, hey, if they're not been reauthorized by the Congress to be the regulatory agencies for our clearinghouses and for this, well, the European Union will stick in. So there are little things like that that we have to be careful of and watch. But let's get to this specific issue that concerns me greatly, and that is with our cryptocurrency business. Now, I understand that there is a proposal pending at the CFTC by a cryptocurrency exchange that is seeking approval to operate a new and untested exchange, new and untested exchange that is seeking approval to operate in a new and untested system of clearing derivative trades. And I'm very concerned about this, very much concerned about this proposal and the broad implications it poses, just like the other things that we've had to protect our financial system from, and the implications across our markets and our intermediaries within this market. And it's not just impacting cryptocurrency. We're dealing with it all over. I'm also on the Finance Committee in the House. We're dealing with it there. There's so much unknown about this. And so, as I said to you before, ever since the financial crisis, we've been moving to make sure that the CFTC's regulatory safeguards governing derivative markets are the strongest that the world will have, and the world will have full confidence in these critical markets. So I'm very concerned that approval of this proposal without due and proper consideration would put all of that hard work at risk by allowing an untested, an unproven system that could very well make our derivatives regulatory system riskier and our customer protections much weaker. Your thoughts, Chairman?
Thank you, Chairman Scott. It's a very important question and a very important issue, and I would just assure you and this committee that as we are considering and contemplating the FTX proposal, we are doing it cautiously, we are doing it very deliberately, and we will be very patient as we consider the proposals and how they intersect and interact with the Commodity Exchange Act and, more importantly, the core principles. At this point, we've done a number of months of review within the Division of Clearing and Risk with FTX. At a point about a month or two ago, I decided that given the novelty of the issue and exactly what you pointed out, the unknown risks and the novelty of the market structure, that it was important for us to put out the proposal for public comment. I initially put it out for 30 days, I extended that to 60 days, and we're in the middle of the public comment period to get ideas from all market participants, from academics and public interest, to see what their thoughts are on the market structure itself and the risk. I would say more generally, two important things. Despite the novelty, as chairman, I feel I have a responsibility to give every stakeholder, every market participant, an opportunity to share their views and to present ideas that they have for the market. I think that's the responsibility of the agency and the U.S. government. The second part is within the Commodity Exchange Act, specifically Section 5, we are mandated to support responsible innovation. And in many respects, this proposal could be a turning point or an inflection point for market structure. I don't know that. I don't believe that right now necessarily, but I do think I have to consider the proposal in case there is a possibility for a new market structure that could provide innovation, provide more efficient markets, better pricing, and better hedging tools. I would just use a quick example going back 30 years when electronic trading and the technology underscoring electronic trading was starting to manifest itself. You probably had a lot of individuals on the iconic trading floors in Chicago and New York who were hesitant to think about electronic trading taking over our markets. But now here we are in 2022, electronic trading is fully embraced, and it's a technology that supports innovation, and I think it's the same concept.
My time is rapidly approaching, and a little bit it's gone over, but this needs far more review. It needs more oversight. This is a situation that I think that, based upon the concerns that I've heard, that this proposal thoroughly considers all of the potential impacts that it could have on this, and particularly many of our clearing houses and those people that we've always had to come in to help. So what I'm asking is that we really put some good oversight to this, make sure questions are answered, and I also want to hear from the other side of this. And so I want everybody to know that I'm going to put together a hearing on Tuesday, May 17th, and I'm inviting in to get their thoughts on this so we make sure that all sides are answered and have their concerns. So I'm going to extend invitations to the CEOs of CME and ICE, the Intercontinental Exchange Commission, and Chicago Mercantile Exchange folks. We need to hear from everybody on this. You need to hear from them. We all do. Just like we've had to do in previous occasions. As I said before, I take great pride in being the #1 protector of our great nation's financial system here, serving both on our finance committee and here as chairman. And so I appreciate this, and I appreciate your deep consideration. I'm very concerned about this. Ranking member, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, Chairman. Thank you. Chairman Benner, I want to continue sort of in the digital commodity space. I published a draft discussion of my Digital Commodity Exchange Act in November, and I'm in the process of putting the finishing touches on that bill after receiving input on the draft from stakeholders. The discussion draft was grounded in 5 principles. Number 1, foster innovation. Number 2 is to protect the market participants. Number 3 is reduce complexity. 4 is to promote principle-based regulation, and 5 is to complement existing authorities where appropriate. Chairman Benham, do you think that those are the appropriate principles that we should be considering as we explore regulating cash digital commodity markets?
Thanks, Ranking Member Thompson. I do. I think at its core, many of the responsibilities that a potential digital asset marketplace or market structure would need are the same that we utilize and enforce and implement within the derivative space. Obviously, the underlying asset is very different, but in terms of market structure and the principles that you just outlined, those are certainly a great starting point and something to build off of.
Excellent. If the CFTC were granted authority over the cash digital commodities market, would you adopt these same foundational principles in your associated rulemakings?
Yes.
Very good. We'll certainly encourage all my colleagues, both sides of the aisle, to join me in this effort. We haven't introduced the bill yet. Would love to have a unified original co-sponsors. We tend to do best when we speak with one voice in the Agriculture Committee. I want revisit what the chairman was talking about. You recently did have the request. You recently requested comment on the proposal by FTX that would allow it to provide direct clearing of margin trades by customers without the use of a futures commission merchant intermediary as it traditionally done by clearinghouses. Chairman Bennett, I want to thank you for requesting the public comment on this unique approach once again, and thank you for extending the comment period to ensure stakeholders have sufficient time to comment on this novel request or proposal. I appreciate your efforts to ensure that the Commission gives the proposal and the comments their full consideration, that the review process is transparent. But I would like to understand a little better the review process for an application like this, and what steps beyond public comment periods will the Commission take to understand the impacts of the proposed changes requested in this application or any application? Really looking at what are the structures within the Commission for these types of proposals.
Thanks, Ranking Member Thompson. There actually isn't a formal legal requirement about a process per se. As I pointed out to the chairman, we've been working with FTX for a number of months now in advance of releasing the public comment. And there's no prohibition or requirement that the current market structure be in place for existing market participants. So as of now, the FTX proposal, albeit novel, is neither prohibited or in violation of the CEA. So we've gone through those first steps. We're going through this comment period right now, which will last to about the beginning or mid-May. And then my intention all along was to conduct a staff roundtable towards the end of May and have a larger conversation about non-intermediation, not about FTX specifically, but just generally about non-intermediation. And the reason I think that's important is because this proposal from FTX is not the first proposal the CFTC has received on non-intermediation. And I assure you, regardless of what happens with FTX approval or rejection, there will be more in the future. This is just a product of technology and the ability to create efficiencies potentially in market structure. So I think it's important as an agency, collectively with your input, that we start to dig into these questions, identify risks, identify opportunities, and hear all viewpoints so that we move in a more informed way and move towards a decision that is comprehensive, that is patient, and as I said, deliberate, so that we know all facts about the proposal.
And thank you for that. Once the Commission has completed its review and is satisfied with its understanding of the application initially, what does the rest of the process look like? For example, some questions. If you're able to answer them, is the Commission able to modify the proposal?
So the Commission could modify the proposal, but it would be really up to the registrant, in this case FTX, if they were comfortable with the required modifications. This certainly happens a lot as we intersect or have conversations with market participants. There's some things they may want originally in a proposal, and we say, look, this doesn't work because of our core principles or regulations. You need to tweak it here, tweak it there. And often registrants are comfortable with that. But depending on the modifications, it would really be up to FTX.
And just real quick, and I know I'm over, I apologize, Chairman, but, I think it's helpful for us to understand the process.
Yeah.
Does the approval of this type of application require a majority commission vote?
It does.
Okay. This one may be asking for a crystal ball for you, and I understand that. But any idea when will the commission be in a position to vote on the application?
Ranking Member Thompson, only when we, and specifically me as chairman, feel that we are very comfortable with the proposal. We've checked all our boxes, we've looked at the structure, and I feel like the commission could make a vote that's well-informed and after debate and consideration and hearing from all constituents.
Well, I don't think I'm overreaching when I say I think both the chairman and I appreciate that response. And, after when you're ready to make that decision. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, both chairmans.
Thank you. And now I recognize the gentlewoman from North Carolina, Ms. Adams, who is also the vice chair of the Committee on Agriculture. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Thompson, for hosting today's hearing, and to Chair Benham for testifying. Thank you for being here today. Moreover, even though they're not here today, I do want to take a moment to congratulate our new commissioners on their confirmations. Congratulations to Commissioners Christy Romero, Kristen Johnson, Summer Mersinger, and Caroline Pyam. So, Commissioner Benham, as you may know, I sit on both the Agriculture and Financial Services Committee, where I oversee our financial system and agricultural markets. I understand that the Cftc has a request for comment out on FTX's registration order. I'm not looking for you to comment on an ongoing process. Having said that, would you please speak to the implications of eliminating the current regime for intermediaries in the decentralized finance space?
Congresswoman, thanks for the question. As I said earlier, it really is an ongoing deliberation of what benefits and risks this proposal may present. As you point out, rightfully so, this is a novel concept about non-intermediation between end user or retail investor and the exchange and the clearinghouse. But as we've been digging into the proposal, much of my thought has been focused on what our responsibility is as the CFTC, is to engage with stakeholders, to hear and listen to their presentations, and to view them in light of possibilities as much as risks. So I would certainly never be comfortable with allowing a proposal to be put into market if we didn't think certainly it met our core principles and our regulations, but that if customer protections were at high risk. However, as I pointed out earlier, it is very clear in the statute that we as the CFTC have a responsibility to support responsible innovation. And there is a possibility that within this market structure, given technology, given the ability to break down some of the segments between retail participation and trade execution, that this proposal could end up leading to more efficient trade execution, less risk in the system.
Okay, thank you so much. I want to get to a couple of other questions. So let me move to another topic. I commend your stated efforts on improving diversity and inclusion at the CFTC, along with your work to create the agency's first chief diversity officer. The need for CDO is imperative, and according to the CFTC, the employee breakdown of management is woefully homogeneous, with only 14 African Americans, 10 Asian Americans, 5 Hispanic Americans at the grade level 15, and only 33% of your senior level employees are women. Number one, first of all, I do find that troubling. So what is your strategy to increase racial, ethnic, and gender diversity at the CFTC? And will the commission plan to include recruitment from historically Black colleges and universities and minority-serving institutions?
Thank you, Congresswoman. To answer your second question first, yes, absolutely, and that's a part of the strategy. With the Chief Diversity Officer, which I appreciate your recognition. I think this is a huge step for the agency. We're going to break down a lot of the silos and barriers that I think have restricted the agency in the past so that we can essentially be casting a wider net for recruitment. and to support retention at the entry level all the way up to the senior level. I'm optimistic about the future. It's going to take time, but I think with the inclusion of the Chief Diversity Officer and a real momentum towards expanding our scope and our invitation to potential employees, we have a real opportunity to diversify the agency.
Well, certainly, and we look forward to that, and whatever help my office can give. I do chair the bipartisan HBCU caucus, and we have the connections with our partnership challenge, and we'll be happy to offer assistance to you. Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to yield back.
The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Austin Scott, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Scott. And Chairman Beenham, in your testimony, you highlight the fact that these are uncertain times and there's currently a lot of volatility in the markets. I think you used the term systemic shock. If you read any of the financial news, you see the terms weaker fundamentals, yield inversion, the word recession is being used increasingly, housing bubble. All of those things are very concerning to me, and especially at the point that the world is facing what it is with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the potential food shortages in Africa and Asia and the lower income parts of the world. That being said, how important would you say it is for us in Congress to figure out a way to allow our derivative clearing organizations and other clearing agencies to access the Federal Reserve to secure their cash?
Thanks, Congressman. I want to be clear as I respond to this question that notion and the idea that you're proposing is not within the CFTC's jurisdiction. This would be a decision by the Federal Reserve.
That's right.
But speaking on behalf of the CFTC and the regulated clearinghouses that we oversee and the conversations I've been having with them, I do think given the volatility we've seen in the market, given what feels like a more frequent period of shocks to the system, right? Whether it was COVID 2 years ago and now the Ukraine crisis, that the collateral movement and the size of the CCPs and the volatility that we're seeing, it's extremely important to consider this this proposal and this idea of having Fed accounts for CCPs.
Well, I look forward to working with you to help make that happen, and this should not be that hard to do. And it would benefit everybody, I think, to have the cash secured at the Federal Reserve. There's no safer place for the system than to have that cash at the Federal Reserve. One other thing I want to mention, I currently have a bill, the CFTC Research and Development Modernization Act. It would grant you, the CFTC, the authority to interact with fintech innovators for research, development, and innovation purposes. Now, research and innovation that helps with risk management is good. If it leads to excessive speculation, then I think it's bad. And I want to share my concerns about FTX that were expressed earlier. But with the world changing as rapidly as it is, can you speak to the importance of how we bridge the gap between the CFTC and the fintech industry so that you as the regulator better understand the emerging technologies and how to regulate the markets?
Thanks, Congressman, and I do appreciate your leadership on that bill. We did recognize at the CFTC a number of barriers that we had to engage with entrepreneurs and innovators, and I think it's important. You know, we've always been a leading agency in innovation and technology. Markets, especially in the derivative space, tend to begin with trading in our markets, and this is best exemplified with the listing of Bitcoin futures contracts back in 2017, which seems like years ago. But it is important that we have that authority and the ability to engage with fintech and entrepreneurs, because it gives us a better sense of risks in the market, how our markets can support innovation, price discovery, and risk management. Because as we know, in all sectors of industry, whether it's ag or manufacturing, having financial markets to be able to lay off risk and mitigate risk supports innovation and growth. That supports research and development and every other thing that large companies need to support their growth over time. So continue to support your efforts here and whatever we can do to break those barriers down so that we can have more communications with entrepreneurs.
Chairman, briefly, I'll tell you, I do think that with the volatility in commodity prices and the input prices in agriculture, I do think that we're going to need to make sure that our farmers and others are able to hedge their risk in the most efficient manners possible. And I appreciate your work to help make that happen. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield the remaining 20 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. And now the gentlewoman from Connecticut, Ms. Hayes, who is also the chair of the Subcommittee on Nutrition, Oversight, and Department Operations, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Beanham, for being here today. My questions for you today are going to focus on the Commodities Futures Trading Commission's whistleblower programs. Since the program was established in the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act of 2010, the Commodities Futures Trading Commission has relied on whistleblower disclosures to identify cases of fraud and other illegal activities and to collect fines on behalf of the American people. The CFTC's Consumer Protection Fund, established by Congress in 2010, is funded through those fines and used to reward whistleblowers for their disclosures. Since issuing its first award in 2014, the CFTC has granted whistleblower awards amounting to approximately $300 million. The information provided by these whistleblowers is crucial and ensures that we are able to properly enforce the Commodities Exchange Act. First, Chairman Beanham, in 2020, the CFTC reached out to Congress with concerns that as a result of several large whistleblower awards they expected to pay, there would be a shortfall in the fund used to pay whistleblower awards and fund administration of the Office of Consumer Education and the Whistleblower Office. As a result, Congress passed a short-term legislative fix, which will expire at the end of this fiscal year. My question is, have those large awards since been issued? And looking ahead to the expiration later of this year, do you expect that there will again be a shortfall at the CFTC?
Congresswoman, thank you for the question. It's extremely important. The short answer to your question about those awards being rewarded is yes, they have been rewarded. And to your second question, I cannot say with certainty whether or not we will have a shortfall. So much of this is unknown, and I think if you go back to Dodd-Frank, you couldn't have contemplated some of the rewards that we distributed in the recent past. They're very, very significant, and they are products of the LIBOR fraud cases from a few years ago. But to your point and to support what you just said, this is just more evidence of the importance of the whistleblower program and how we're able to root out fraud and manipulation with the support of whistleblowers. So I can't say for certain whether or not we're going to run out, but it sounds like you would support what I'm about to say, is that I think we should err on the side of it's possible and we need to have the program fixed as soon as possible so that we can have the staff in place, that the Consumer Education Fund can be funded appropriately, and that we can have the funds to provide whistleblowers when those cases are filed.
You're absolutely right. I think that the whistleblower program is extremely important, and we saw that it reached record highs in 2020. What do you believe this was a result of? Was it increased violations, better enforcement, or just an atmosphere where people feel that there's a process for expressing their concerns about fraud?
I think it's a combination of all of those things. I certainly think over time since 2010, when Dodd-Frank was passed and this provision was put into law, that more individuals within the financial system are aware of the benefits of the whistleblower program and that they can come to the agency, feel protected, that what they're about to do is not going to come back to them, and that they will be rewarded for their service to the government and to the American people and the American financial system. But more notably, I did mention this, and you probably recall that we had some very, very significant cases filed and settled in the past 5 to 10 years regarding the LIBOR fraud and manipulation, and those were hundreds, if not billions of dollar cases that ended up resulting in some of these significant fines. Will we see them again in the future? Again, I can't predict, but I would prefer to err on the side of caution and say we need a very resilient and strong whistleblower program with a very strong and resilient fund so that we can continue this program in support of American financial markets.
Well, thank you so much for your time and for your testimony today. And I'm mindful of the time, but I cannot end my testimony without just saying how proud I am to be from Connecticut, where Senator Chris Dodd, this was so incredibly important to him, and he worked so hard for this legislation to be passed. And I encourage you, Chairman Beanham, that if problems that are uncovered that require congressional action, that they are brought to our attention immediately, because this is something that I think is critical to ensuring that our financial markets and all of our actors are playing by the same set of rules. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
He must be on Zoom.
Thank you very much. And now the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Crawford, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Bean, for being here today. And I guess there's been a lot of talk about crypto, so I'm going to go crypto just real quick. I guess safe to say that crypto is here to stay. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So having said that, I think most people would agree with that statement. I know you supported legislation that would expand CFTC's jurisdiction over digital commodities markets. Can you talk about that a little bit? Why you think that's a good choice?
Well, I think in order to, on two sides of the equation is one, there are risks inherent in the market right now. It is a largely unregulated market. We have some state transmitter licenses that are really directing the regulatory space, and there's benefits to that, but it's not enough, quite frankly. And what we're seeing in terms of the growth and the scale of the market, it's a very retail-oriented market. It's highly speculative, and we've seen that with the price movements in some of the larger digital assets. I think it is incumbent on Congress and regulators to work together to have a structured regulatory regime around markets. It will both protect customers, reduce market stability issues, create market resiliency, which is extremely important, ultimately protect customers, and then possibly have the benefit of supporting innovation if there is outcomes that we're going to see beneficial in the future.
You think we need statutory language that defines digital commodity, digital securities?
Yes, it would be extremely important to do that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I want to shift gears a little bit with you. My colleague, Mr. Scott, mentioned this, and you and I had a conversation earlier this week alluding to this, and that is the growing need, I think, for farmers to be adequately hedged using these tools that are regulated by the CFTC. And so we discussed the potential for CFTC being the lead agency in an extension outreach to educate end users, primarily agricultural producers, on how they could benefit. Can you talk a little bit about how that might look?
Sure. Thank you for the question, and I really enjoyed speaking with you about this. You know, we have a very well built out consumer education office within the agency. I pointed out to you, and this committee knows well, we are rooted in agriculture. We were once a part of USDA, and as I said in my statement, I think it is a priority of mine to ensure that American producers understand our markets and feel that they have a cost-effective risk management tool in American futures and options markets. And there are many challenges, there are many risks, there are obviously other programs that USDA provides which are critically important, but this CFTC markets should just be another tool in the toolbox for American farmers and ranchers to hedge extreme volatility, extreme price risk, which we continue to see over the years. So I would certainly welcome to work with you, with folks back in Arkansas, use the extension program across the country, and utilize our education office to inform folks about markets, to answer questions if necessary, and to do whatever we can to support at the producer level, at the elevator level, and everyone in between, so that they know CFTC markets are available and an effective risk management tool.
Well, I appreciate that, and we will definitely look forward to working with you on that front. One thing I have to mention, I would be remiss if I didn't, and that is the impact that China has on our commodities markets. And I'm just curious what tools are available to you, and I'm not even sure this is the best venue to address this question, but what tools are available to identify or to identify red flags as it applies to China and the potential for them to manipulate markets? Do you have any of those tools available, and what action can be taken to prevent that?
Well, certainly for domestic markets, we have the tools we need from a surveillance perspective and a market oversight perspective. We definitely have international participants in our markets, and we observe that with the crisis in Ukraine, identifying folks who are on the sanctions list. So we're able to see participants, identify where they're from, and if there were a case of fraud or manipulation from individuals in China, we would able to root that out. We're seeing that market grow pretty extensively over the past couple years. There's a number of futures markets in China. I think on the one hand, we're going to need to work with those individuals and those institutions. China, obviously, as this committee knows, is a huge purchaser of American agricultural products. But I feel very strongly that we need to ensure our commodity markets remain the strongest in the world. They benchmark major commodities across the ag complex, energy complex, and the metals complex. And those are the types of things I'll be thinking about and look forward to working with you to ensure that resiliency and primacy of American agriculture in our markets over the decades to come.
Thanks so much. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. And now the gentlewoman from Ohio, Ms. Brown, is recognized for 4 minutes. 5 minutes. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Scott and Ranking Member Thompson for holding this hearing today. And thank you to Chairman Benham for being here. The CFTC has long been underfunded. Since your confirmation as chair in January, have you been able to evaluate whether the CFTC has adequate staffing and resources to effectively carry out its responsibilities?
Thank you, Congresswoman. That is certainly something I do on a regular basis, working with our CFO and our folks in the budget office, working with appropriators as well. I would say that what I've observed even in the past few years, let alone nearly 5 that I've been at the commission as both the commissioner and chair, is that our markets continue to grow. We continue to see a larger pool of participants and registrants. And with that comes a larger responsibility for us to interact with the agency constituency and also new participants. So I do think we will need an increased budget to deal with all of these issues in the digital asset space, obviously in our core markets, but it is increasingly becoming a challenge to deal with these issues and protect markets.
Okay, so you touched on a few things. What more can Congress do to support the agency?
Well, I think from an authorities perspective, we do have the authority we need over our traditional markets. I've publicly stated, and I know Ranking Member Thompson has talked about digital asset authority, and I fully support that. But in terms of my direct engagement with Congress and ask is to continue to think about our funding levels. We fell a little bit short this past fiscal year, but looking forward, we will be asking for a little bit more, and that is a direct result of the interaction we're having with an increasingly large pool of market participants and increasingly large responsibility we have over growing markets.
Thank you for that. In your testimony, you highlighted the agency's commitment to responsible innovation and fair competition among market participants. With the rapid growth of digital assets over the last several years, many of the barriers to entry to the finance industry have been reduced. How is CFTC responding to a more diverse market participation?
Thanks, Congresswoman. It's a great question, and we are in fact seeing that in our markets. Barriers are being eliminated because of technology, and there's more retail participation in our markets, which I think is overall a positive thing, but it does come with a great responsibility. And that responsibility as a regulator is to ensure customer protections are in place, to ensure disclosures and information flow is fair and equitable across all income levels and investor education levels. And we are currently working within our groups, most notably the Market Participants Division and the Office of Consumer Education, to do extensive outreach, inclusive outreach, and really, as I was saying earlier, to touch parts of our country and our market that we historically have not touched. And I think it's really important because as we all use our phone and download apps and have access to any number of things much easier than we did even a few years ago, The same is the case for financial markets, and we need to assume that will only increase over time, but with that comes a great responsibility. So that will be a priority of ours to work with communities that we historically have not touched or engaged with and make sure they know about the risks and opportunities of new technology so that they can make the most informed decisions for their wallet and their household.
All right, thank you. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. And now the gentleman from California, Mr. Lamafa, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to weigh in a little bit more on the issue with how the futures will be affected with what we're really looking at with the Ukrainian market for as much crops as they grow and how much they are part of the world market in exports, and tying that back into derivatives. So how can derivative markets help to address the imbalances that we're going to see with so much uncertainty in that portion of the market, as well as my home state, where water is being cut off to farms? I think the number, we don't know quite yet, but we could see 70% of irrigated acres in California cut off from water, partly because of drought, but a lot of it's because of man-made drought with mismanagement of water and it being devoted towards environmental purposes and fish habitat and things like that. So what kind of disruptions do we expect for these commodities, and how do derivatives help to balance that out?
Thanks, Congressman. And I know you know this, but just to be clear, we are price agnostic. We do not set prices. Our markets they serve two main purposes: risk management and price discovery. So in response to your question, the two purposes and the two benefits of our markets as we're dealing with these crises, both internationally and as you say, domestically as a result of any number of issues, is to help producers, to help users, utilities, anyone who has to have commodities as a part of their business or their operations, is to see both price discovery and anticipate risks, challenges, and costs that may come in the future, but then ultimately risk management. And that's to be able to hedge risks going out, if not months, years, so that they can have steady, stable prices and know what they're going to be able to have to pay for costs, inputs on the input side, but also charge customers. So this has been the purpose and the use of derivatives for decades. It will continue to be that. I think from a CFTC perspective, our main goal is to ensure that markets are fair, transparent, orderly, and free from fraud and manipulation, and are properly reflecting the dynamics of supply and demand. Obviously, those dynamics change significantly with weather, with geopolitical issues, with socioeconomic issues, but we just need to make sure that all of those factors are at their core being treated fairly, and that we don't have fraud and manipulation influencing prices at all.
So bottom line, the derivatives markets help to balance and cushion some of that
Absolutely.
Uncertainty.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Also, Chairman Benham, is there, on the CFTC, this question may have been asked, I couldn't hear it earlier. It's on how is CFTC being staffed out at this point and return to work? Are we going to be able to expect normal service and operations are underway or soon underway, so good work can be done, an expectation for basically for the customers after the last 2 years?
Thank you, Congressman. We're in the process of transitioning back to the office. I myself and my staff around me have been back in the office since last fall, and I think my goal is to just make the process orderly and be cautious. Understand that folks have both gotten accustomed, but returning to work will take time. But my goal is to get folks back into the office as soon as possible. There are a number of issues that we're going to need to deal with in terms of negotiations and getting folks comfortable. But hopefully, as soon as possible, we'll be back at the office. with an understanding that things have changed and that by and large, we were able to accomplish our short-term goals and mission while we were remote. But there are also important longer-term issues that we have to deal with as an agency, the culture of the agency, and the health of the agency in the years ahead. And those are things that I think about as we think about a post-pandemic work environment to ensure that the agency is healthy, we're recruiting, we're retaining, and that there's a long-term successful story for the CFTC to tell. And ultimately, as you pointed out, we're doing our job serving the customers we have and also the American taxpayers who are hard at work, and we owe it to them to make sure markets are fair, resilient, transparent, and not causing risks that should not be happening.
And open, yeah, it's high time we get back rolling again as we're suffering economically. And so well, I appreciate it. My time's up, I'll yield back.
The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, is recognized for 5 minutes.
I certainly want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this outstanding hearing. My question is directed to Chairman Bayman. Chairman Bayman, in your testimony, you briefly mentioned new and existing policies to fortify the CFTC's markets against cyber attacks. Can you provide a brief orientation of the existing policies as well as the new proposals that you will recommend to fully protect our markets from cyber attacks?
Thank you, Congressman. It's an extremely important question. Right now, we have a policy within our core principles that relates to system safeguards. And within system safeguards, our examiners, most notably with clearinghouses, do annual examinations for the systemically important clearinghouses and ad hoc examinations for the non-systemically important clearinghouses. But within those system safeguards, we analyze cybersecurity issues, information security issues, and business resiliency issues, among others. Those are the core responsibilities we have with an examinations process. As we've seen an increase in cyber attacks as a result of the Ukraine crisis, but just generally across the globe, I think it's extremely important, as you point out, that we increase our resiliency, that we increase the questions we're asking, the intersection and engagement that we have with our market participants going beyond the clearinghouses, talking to the FCMs, the futures commissions merchants, the swap dealers, any market participant that could be a point of access for a cyber attack and have a cascading effect across our markets and potentially all financial markets. So we're currently in the process of thinking how we can examine that existing suite of examinations that we have right now that's in statute, and certainly look forward to working with you if you have any ideas that we can consider. But it's an extremely important issue, puts our markets at risk, and something that we all have to collectively think about very hard.
And is there any role that you would ask the Congress to play in terms of helping you to fully engage and fully develop protections for our markets?
Congressman, I think in terms of authority, we have the authority we need. I would say there's one point I'll mention, and it has to do with vendor risk or third-party service providers. This is something that market regulators typically do not have. So you can imagine we have direct intersection in a relationship with our registrants, but often the registrants are outsourcing or dealing with vendors on the backside of their relationship with us. We certainly trust our registrants and know that they're doing what's in the best interest of their own business, but I think there may be something to consider there in terms of our relationship with vendors and third-party service providers. The other thing I'll mention very quickly is funding. This is becoming more complex, more costly in terms of both personnel and the expertise they have for cyber issues, for digital asset issues. The cost of these techniques, of these, the technology, both the hardware and the software, is growing. It's becoming more complex, and as I look at some of our private sector registrants, the amount of resources that they're piling into technology relative to their other business segments is just growing. And that, I think, has to be the same case for us. We are, in my view, a value add to the American taxpayer. We brought in over $1 billion in fiscal 2021, nearly $1 billion in 22. We are a value add, and I think we should be viewed as that and hopefully properly funded so that we can build these infrastructure points on technology and protect American markets.
Well, thank you. I have an additional question in my remaining seconds. I'm very much interested as the chairman of the Energy Subcommittee on the Energy and Commerce Committee. I'm interested in your climate risk unit and in the recommendations in the climate-related market risk subcommittee's report that was published in September of 2020. Can you please give me some indication of an update on these efforts, and can you provide us with an update for the climate risk unit activities since it was created a year ago?
Yes, thank you, Congressman. I created the Climate Risk Unit in March of 2021. Currently, it's staffed by about 15 to 20 staff across different divisions, and they're in the process of coming up. In my mind, it's a bit of a binary approach that we're going to think about what we can do from a regulatory standpoint to create more resilience in our markets, what we can do to support innovation and resiliency and combat physical risk related to climate change. The other element is transition risk, which we all know is a huge risk as we transition, hopefully in an orderly manner, to a net zero economy. What we can do at the CFTC, engaging with private market participants to come up with innovative ideas to support financial markets, especially derivatives, to help mitigate physical risk and to manage price risk. There's so many opportunities, and we're seeing this grow exponentially within our markets from market participants. And from my view, the Climate Risk Unit will do what it can to engage, to understand and price risk, but to set out an initiative and a plan for supporting these strategies within the market. From a time standpoint, we're going to look forward to the ends of the year in terms of coming out with some proposals.
The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Allen, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, thank you for your comments regarding FTX and also ranking member and also Mr. Scott and all of that we've heard here today. I would like to associate, rather than continue to comment on that, associate my comments with their comments and my concern for this. I do have one question on that. And of course, we have the Chicago Mercantile Exchange and the Intercontinental Exchange, which is the method we're currently using for clearinghouse, okay, which are heavily regulated, I might add. Now you have FTX, which is not regulated. So I just want to make sure that when all this comes to be, that it's a fair playing field for everybody. In other words, I'm sure that CME and ICE are both innovating and doing what they can to do more with less people and to provide the greatest return, but under the current regulatory environment. But can you comment on the fact that hey, we're going to have a fair playing field here for everybody at the end of the day?
Congressman, 100%. I'm legally obligated, and I think it's fair that everyone get a fair shake and that everyone play from the same field. It's extremely important. It's something that I've stood by as long as I've been at the commission, and especially within this particular instance that you raise, FTX. We will make sure that the rules apply fairly and equitably to every stakeholder.
Good, and I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Now going back to your role in we've already talked about it extensively, your role as far as the economy. And, frankly, the dashboard is a little scary right now. Inflation, government debt, the Fed basically has no tools in the box. I mean, it's either shut the economy down into a a recession like we saw in the 70s and interest rates like we saw in the 70s, or continue, putting money into this money supply, which is causing, I mean, you got the perfect recipe for inflation out here right now. And it's all driven by this war on fossil fuel. Fossil fuel is in everything. I mean, right now there's a huge shortage. The big problem in Ukraine and Europe is the shortage of diesel fuel. Farmers aren't going to be able to plant. We're going to have famine in this world. And we can't help them because we're at 50% of production that we were just 3 years ago. We can't sustain this. So what role is your organization playing in this whole economic situation to get this dashboard back in the way it should look as far as reasonable inflation, government, reducing government debt, reducing government spending, everything that is contributing to this economic downfall?
Thanks, Congressman. Obviously, an extremely important question given all that we're dealing with in the markets today, both domestically and internationally. As you know, we are at the agency price agnostic. We don't set prices, whether it's on treasuries or corn and soybeans or oil and natural gas. But from my perspective, our number one responsibility is to ensure that our markets are operating fairly in an orderly fashion and free from fraud and manipulation. If they are in fact doing that, and I am confident they are, then our market participants, whether it's within the government, official sector, or private market participants, are able to use our markets for price discovery and hedging. And those become extremely important tools for our farmers.
But you have an obligation to investors, okay, or to those agencies, the clearinghouses. And it's subject to economic dashboard indicators. Certainly, what would be your advice to this administration right now to deal with the risk of what we're running here? I mean, we don't want to go back to 2008 where we had the mortgage-backed securities issue. We know we've got bubbles out there. But you're part of the team. Mm-hmm. You've got an area territory to protect. I mean, what are you doing to look at the big picture and say, hey, we can't sustain this?
Congressman, I participate within the Financial Stability Oversight Council. I frequently talk with my colleagues across the government and other regulators. I would say this, that what we have faced in the past 2 years is unprecedented, right? With the once-in-a-century pandemic and the economic response to that, where we had a supply shock, a demand shock, and then the recovery over several months, followed by now the crisis in Ukraine, and given the importance from a commodity perspective of both Russia and Ukraine in ags and energy. So I do think collectively we're doing everything we can, the best we can, understanding the dynamics of the American consumer, under the dynamics of supply restraints, and understanding the very quick pivot towards a return to normal in terms of demand, but a much slower supply because of labor issues and supply issues. So It's a challenging issue. We're looking into it. We look at the data. We're trying to be data-driven, but it's a process and it's going to take time. And I'm hopeful of the path that we're on.
We don't have a lot of time. This thing is getting serious. Thank you. Now I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from New Hampshire, Ms. Custer, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Scott, and welcome to the Agriculture Committee, Chairman Bainum. We appreciate you being here, and I would agree with you, these are unprecedented times, so I appreciate your leadership. In the nearly half century since Congress established the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, it's evolved to tackle a wide swath of financial commodities beyond just its roots in agriculture. As CFTC's mission continues to grow alongside new markets, including digital and crypto assets, it's imperative for this committee to understand what you will need from Congress to be successful. So speaking of digital assets, Mr. Chairman, I know you've noted previously the digital asset market is unique in that it's largely a retail market. What are some of the core customer protections that would be needed in a regulatory framework for the digital asset market? And are there core principles in the Commodity Exchange Act that can be applied here to protect consumers?
Thank you, Congresswoman. It's a very important question, and in many respects, and I've said this in the past, market structure can be very similar despite assets that are traded on those markets being different. So what I mean, whether it's an equity security or fixed income product or a derivative. And our core principles obviously are driven from the derivative standpoint, mostly commodities, obviously anything from financials and agriculture and energy commodities. But as we think about digital assets and the potential regulatory structure being built around digital assets, I think it's important to use many of the market structure principles and the core principles, as you note, as the building blocks for what might become a regulatory market structure. From a customer protection standpoint, it's all about segregation of assets, which becomes very, very difficult within digital assets, and something that we're working on very hard because it's so unique from traditional assets. Execution and settlement. These are core elements of a trade from user to settlement that we have to be thinking about collectively with your help and support so that we can ensure customers know what they're doing as they're trying to execute trades or get exposure to digital assets, but also feel comfortable both from an intermediary standpoint potentially or an exchanges standpoint and the regulator standpoint that we're doing everything we can and fulfilling our responsibility to know that their assets are being protected, and if that something happens, that there will be individuals that are held accountable.
Great. That's reassuring. So I know there also been significant discussion about FTX's recent proposal to amend the registration as a derivatives clearing organization, and that the Commission presently put that proposal out for public comment. Mr. Chairman, the Treasury Department has been tasked with the leadership role in the development of a digital asset regulatory regime. I wonder if you've consulted with Secretary Yellen on this proposal.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I have not directly spoken with Secretary Yellen about it. I know my staff has spoken with a number of the other agencies about the proposal. There is a distinction between some of the efforts started by President Biden and the executive order and what the FTX order is currently proposing. The FTX order, there are listed derivatives contracts on Bitcoin and Ether on an FTX exchange currently that are trading and have been trading for a number of years. What the proposal is doing is it's requesting to amend the existing order that contemplates those derivatives, those futures contracts, and changing the market structure. So as much as there is some relationship between what's going on within the U.S. government and President Biden's executive order, there is a separation that I think is certainly unique to the CFTC because it is explicitly focused on derivatives and futures and not anything else.
Okay, great. I have limited time, but just briefly switching gears, I'm also interested, as my colleague, Mr. Rush, addressed climate change and trying to minimize climate-related risks to our financial system. And you've talked about the Climate Risk Unit and the Climate-Related Market Risk Subcommittee. Is there anything that you would want to add to elaborate on your vision for the Climate Risk Unit during your tenure, and how they can identify sensible reforms within the Commission's regulatory framework?
Thank you, Congresswoman.
7 seconds left.
Yeah, they're in the process of working on exactly what you said, and I'm hopeful by the year's end we're going to come out with some thoughtful proposals that the Commission can consider to build more resilient markets against climate change.
Great. Well, we'd love to hear about it on our committee, and with that, I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. And now the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis.
Thank you,
You're
Chair.
recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Thompson, for holding this hearing to discuss the state of the CFTC and how we as members of Congress can support its core principles. Along with many of my colleagues here today, I'm concerned about the state of our economy due to the Biden pro-spending, pro-inflation agenda that only looks to be gearing up to get worse for constituents under the president's new Build Back Broke budget. The impact that the new CFTC rules and regulations may have on market participants and ultimately our farmers, our ranchers, and our constituents who rely on the commodities and contracts that are being traded is something I'm very concerned about, and I hope the Commission is carefully reviewing. The CFTC's risk management requirements embedded in its core principles provide market participants with several layers of safeguards to ensure that risk is properly managed, customers are protected, and the markets that are so critical to our food and our energy supply, they remain stable. I'm very concerned about this as we look at the challenges these markets have faced over the last few years and are likely to continue to face as global events drive commodity price volatility, which I'm sure that many of my colleagues in front of me have addressed with you. But my question for you, Chairman Benham, regarding the idea of a direct-to-customer non-intermediated derivatives clearing model, how would this work with the CFTC's risk management standards that are built around an intermediated clearing model?
Thanks, Congressman. You're right. The standards in some respect are built around an intermediated model, but they don't require an intermediated model. And I think given technological advancements in our ability to access markets, and I mentioned this earlier, thinking back decades when farmers and producers had to call up an associated person, an introducing broker, and then get an order out to the Chicago Board of Trade, those lines can all be reduced now because of technology. And I think what the proposal is trying to do in a non-intermediated model is to take advantage of technology so that we can break down some of these silos and have more direct access. I'm not supporting it at all. I think what my responsibility is to look at the proposal. I said this earlier, Section 5 requires me to support responsible innovation, and there's a possibility that this idea, if responsible and if it meets our core principles, can be a next step in market structure.
Do these standards need to be formally updated to account for the differences in these models? And do you guys at the CFTC intend to do this?
I don't think standards needs to change. You know, we are a principles-based regulator, as you point out. So when you think about principles-based, we largely look at outcomes and not necessarily a check-the-box routine of how we get to the outcome. And that, in fact, gives us the flexibility we need to support innovation in the market. So as long as we're looking at risk assessments, margin methodologies, and how market structure functions, if the math is done, I often use that phrase, and we feel comfortable within the sort of sphere of what the proposal is, I don't think we necessarily need to change any rules.
Okay, but should this model be allowed to go forward before the commission decides what rules or standards should be in place? And shouldn't there be clear rules of the road?
So we're not going to allow, we have not allowed the model to be rolled out. We are in the process of having a public comment period. I said earlier, my intention is to have a staff roundtable on non-intermediated market structure. We are going to be deliberate. We are going to be cautious. We are going to engage with you and others to make sure that we're thinking about the risks and opportunities before we approve or disapprove anything. I think it's my responsibility to engage fair and equitably with all stakeholders and ensure that we're doing what our job is as the CFTC.
Well, Chairman, I do want to ask if in your exchange with Mr. Crawford, you noted the value of having a statutory definition of digital commodity. One additional challenge with that is who gets to interpret that definition. Today, the SEC has the first crack at determining what assets are securities. If we define digital commodities and provide the CFTC jurisdiction over these assets, should the CFTC be in a similar position of having first crack at what defining a digital commodity is?
Yes.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. And now the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. O'Halloran, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Scott and Ranking Member Thompson for organizing this important meeting today. I also want to thank Chairman Benham for working with us to advance the CFTC's mission of promoting integrity and resilience in the derivatives markets. Mr. Chairman, I listened to your opening remarks today, and it brought me back to a little bit of my memory of history. While you were working on those issues, I was too. I was on the Board of Trade's Board of Directors for a number of years, back when those European issues were being brought up at first, and I'm thankful that you were on that process also. But right now, climate change poses a systemic threat to our financial system. The challenges we face right now are undeniably real and urgent. And right now, not exactly do we have the tools to work on those in the way we need to. Climate change related risks can be sudden and physical, like wildfires and flooding, which cause acute shocks to the system and sharp increases in economic damages, more and more so it seems with each year. Those of us in northern and eastern Arizona are certainly aware of these challenges, as we have seen increasingly deadly wildfires coupled with post-fire flooding. The risk can also be chaotic and subtle, like rising temperatures and persistent drought. Economically, these gradual changes can affect insurance and mortgage markets, loans, crop yields, and home values. We are seeing these impacts right now in Pinal County, Arizona, where farmers are forced to let farmland lay fallow due to water use restrictions. I guess the main piece here for me is that this is a connected environment. It's on the business side of the environment, it's on the family side of the environment, the economic side of the entire country, and the world. And we need to be able to have the tools necessary to address those both in the marketplace and in the field. Additionally, there is economic risk in transitioning too quickly to net zero, which could harm smaller companies that don't have the resources to adapt as easily as their larger competitors or counterparts. Chairman, I was pleased to see you establish the Climate Risk Unit last year to strategically address the climate risk in the derivatives markets. Can you please provide an update on how the Climate Risk Unit has spent the past year and what you see as the unit's next step in addressing the climate threat? How will the Climate Risk Unit help farmers, ranchers, and constituents in Arizona manage the increasing risk climate change poses to their livelihoods?
Thanks, Congressman. Appreciate the question. And as you noted, I formed the Climate Risk Unit in March of 2021 with the intent of essentially collecting the certain experts within the agency across divisions so that we could collectively think about what the agency could do from a regulatory standpoint to both engage with stakeholders, including agricultural stakeholders, and essentially supporting innovation in our markets to tackle both physical risk associated with climate change and, as you point out, the transition risk associated with climate change. Derivatives markets are inherently risk management agencies, so I think this is natural to us. But as you point out, the increasing risks of climate change that we're seeing across the country and the globe are going to affect farmers, ranchers, manufacturers, and we need to address those issues as soon as possible. So my hope is by the end of this calendar year, we're going to have a first step proposal of ideas, regulatory, to bring before the commission, and certainly welcome sharing them with you so that you can give us your input if you'd like.
I remember a time when we were trading grains in Chicago, and when it rained on LaSalle Street, there was no drought in America, because all of a sudden people would trade a little bit differently because of the all of a sudden rain's coming down. That's not true anymore. That wasn't true then. But now the reality is we have to be much more aware of what's going on throughout the world in climate. It's having a profound impact. And while I have a couple of seconds left here, I just want to say my concerns for the CFTC are the same today as they were before. I do not feel that you have enough personnel or budget to be able to address the many issues that you are facing and will be facing, and that includes the Bitcom and all the other factors that go into that, and I'll look forward to talking to you on those issues. Thank you.
And thank you, Mr. O'Halloran. And now the gentleman from South Dakota, Mr. Johnson, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, sir. And Mr. Chairman, I would be remiss if I didn't start by talking about my friend, Summer Mersinger. She and I grew up just 30 miles away from one another, and I have known her for a long time. And I'm sure you would agree with me, sir, that she's exceptionally well qualified to serve with you on the CFTC. Incredible integrity, incredible prudence, She is going to be very much value added as you all together pursue your risk management and price discovery missions. So please greet her warmly for me when you see her next, sir, if you would.
Absolutely. And I agree with you wholeheartedly.
Yeah. You know, and when I want to be famous in DC, I tell people I know Summer. That's what a big deal she is in this town. So anyway, I want to talk with you a little bit about equivalency, sir. You know, in the immediate aftermath of Brexit, we spoke a lot with your predecessor about what clearinghouse equivalency, European Union, cross-border access. I mean, talk to me a little bit about where we're at today on those issues.
Thanks, Congressman. Extremely important question. And I would say from an EU perspective, we're in good position. We had obviously a number of challenges, but thanks to you and this committee, as the chairman pointed out, and a number of the members, given your incredibly strong input over the past few years, we are in a good place with the European Union. We have a well-established relationship under an MOU, and we have preserved the primacy of the CFTC as the home country regulator for our registrants, including CCPs. That said, there are always more issues out there. Brexit was not a one-incident event. We continue to see repercussions because of Brexit, and they will exist for a number of years going forward. So we're currently in communication with a number of regulators, including those at the UK, as they contemplate their life post-Brexit, and ensuring that we build off of that strong, long-lasting relationship between the United States and the UK, and ultimately, as I point out, and I know you believe, preserving the primacy of the US regulator, specifically here, the CFTC, over our domestic CCPs. And as chairman, I'll continue to make those arguments strongly, to ensure folks understand the well-established rules and regulations we have, and the great financial markets that we steward. And certainly welcome your support, but also we'll keep you up to date as those developments and discussions go along.
So it sounds to me, Mr. Chairman, that things have gone about as well as they could have, and obviously your team at CFTC deserves a lot of credit for that. There was tremendous uncertainty a couple of years ago about whether or not we would end up in this spot. And of course, you're right, it's an ongoing challenge. There's still work to be done, but we're sitting about as well as could be expected. Is that right?
I think that's fair to say, but I would never rest on my laurels, because I do think there are a number of issues out there that I'm trying to catch them early so they don't become an issue, that they don't raise to the level of this committee. And we continue to have staff level conversations. I continue to have conversations with my counterparts over the UK and other jurisdictions to ensure that what happened in the EU a few years ago does not happen again, and that no one gets ideas about what they can or think they should do because of some regulatory shift or some market shift. So we're going to keep sending that message very clearly across the globe, and I'll do my part as best I can, and I'm hopeful that I'll be successful. But if things change, I'll certainly report back to you.
So how about from the perspective of the United Kingdom? Of course, that's not your job nor mine, but have they also been able to secure a good landing spot in the wake of Brexit?
It's a good question, and you're right, because it wasn't just the EU who suffered or who had an outcome as a result of Brexit. It was the UK, of course, as well. And as the EU was starting to think about what they were going to do from a regulatory perspective, perhaps the UK was just a little bit behind, but we're having those conversations right now. I am confident that we are having conversations that are heading in the right direction. And what I mean by that is preserving US primacy, preserving primacy of the CFTC as the home country regulator, leaning on the existing relationship between the CFTC and my counterpart agency, and above all else, using the foundational relationship between the United States of America and the United Kingdom, allowing them to trust us and the regulations we have and the institutions that we have and supervise, as much as we need to trust them and the supervision that they conduct over their institutions. So I'm going to lean on those principles and ensure
and frankly,
we're
it's probably more valuable than the question I was asking. And I'm out of time, so if your team can follow up afterwards. I guess I was asking more about whether or not the European Union and their regulatory agreements with the United Kingdom is going to allow United Kingdom the flexibility they need to also maintain how they operate, because I just think there could be a broader impact on, global markets if there are disruptions in that relationship. But thank you very much, and sir, I yield back.
And Chairman Byman, feel free to respond in writing
Sure.
to Mr. Johnson's question.
I apologize, Congressman, for not directly answering the question, but
he's one of our very strong, bright members, and you can respond in writing. We want to get to as many members. The gentleman from California, Mr. Garbahal, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chairman Benham, thank you for testifying before us today. California knows the effects of climate change well. We consistently experience severe drought and intense wildfires that threaten the future of all crops, not just commodity crops. I think you're right that the CFTC has a role to play in addressing climate change. I applaud you for the creation of the Climate Risk Unit to focus on mitigating climate-related risks. Climate change is not a new and emerging risk. Climate change has been here, but we have been late to act on it. Chairman Benham, can you walk me through what role the CFTC can play in helping foster investments to promote a smooth transition to renewable energy sources? And what are some challenges you see with renewable energies competing against oil and gas futures?
Thanks, Congressman. It's extremely important to have risk management markets and price discovery markets, and I think we've seen that. Our markets date back over 150 years and in many respects have been a building block and a foundation for the success of the American economy for decades. And I don't think that's any different now as we think about transition to a net zero economy. So as chairman, and as you pointed out, forming the Climate Risk Unit, my goals are going to be to engage with market participants, with stakeholders, with innovators, so that our markets can continue to serve that purpose, that we can see innovation in a product development space, so that folks, as they're transitioning to renewables or transitioning their companies to a net zero environment, they can lean on our markets to manage the risks that are going to come along that way. Because as you point out, there will be many risks, it will be difficult, but we need to continue to push forward in that transition in an orderly way to ensure resilience against climate change. There are certainly many issues, and we're dealing with them now in terms of the Ukraine crisis, but I do think it's incumbent to be balanced, to be fair, and to move the transition forward, but understanding that transition risk is real, and that we're going to have to, in many respects, think about issues and challenges on a daily basis and understand that we're going to need to lean on fossil fuels for a number of years, hopefully in a downward trajectory, but in order to power America as we transition to renewables, we're going to need to lean on those existing energy sources to get to where we need to get in 2030, 2040, and 2050. So I'm hopeful that our markets will continue to manage and support a transition in an orderly way and allow producers, manufacturers to use our markets to eliminate that price risk and eliminate those externalities which we will all face as we deal with climate change and those risks in the years ahead.
Thank you. In the CFTC report, Managing Climate Risks in the U.S. Financial Systems, one of the recommendations made is requiring credit rating agencies to disclose the extent to which their ratings take into account climate risk. Can you elaborate on what you think this system might look like? And do you think this approach will encourage climate-friendly business practices?
Thank you, Congressman. I do want to just clarify that report, which I'm very proud of, but it was an advisory committee, so it was not a product of the commission per se. I did convene a number of market participants to put together the report and make recommendations, which were exhaustive in scope and very helpful, I think, and a stepping stone for what we're seeing in the Biden administration. With respect to that particular recommendation, when I think about that recommendation, it makes me think about the financial crisis and the important role of credit rating agencies and ensuring that they're transparent, that they're fair, and that they're transmitting information as clearly as possible end users. And in this case, this is often investors, whether it's local governments, pension funds, or individual investors. So as we start to see the growing risks related to climate change, whether it's flood or fire or any number of other issues, these are going to impact local communities, these are going to impact states and ultimately the United States. And I think as the investing community needs to know, we need to know what these risks are so that we can allocate capital efficiently, appropriately, and as best informed as possible.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Now, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Balderson, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Both chairmen, thank you, Chairman, for testifying today. And you discussed in your testimony the importance of cybersecurity at the CFTC. As I am sure you know, a 2020 audit by the Office of the Inspector General spelled out recommendations for the CFTC to follow in order to mitigate cybersecurity risk for registrants. What progress have the divisions of market oversight and clearing and risk made on implementing the Inspector General's recommendations?
Congressman, thanks for the question. It was a very serious and important recommendation. We obviously take those very seriously across the board, but particularly within the context of cybersecurity, as I pointed out, and you certainly recognize, we are on heightened alert across the board given what we're dealing with the Ukraine crisis, but cybersecurity becomes an even more critical issue to address. So with those recommendations, we are currently in the process of making possible changes so that we can improve our systems, become more resilient across the agency, and ultimately send a message to our constituents and our market participants that we are as fortified as possible in protecting the markets that we are asked to serve and do.
All right, thank you. But following up on that, Chairman, what resources did the CFTC require from Congress to fully implement the Inspector General's recommendations and to further alleviate any additional cybersecurity risk?
From an authorization standpoint, I don't think we need additional authority. I've said this before and I'll repeat it, given the risks associated with cybersecurity, given the resource challenges both on the personnel side, on the technology hardware side, and the technology software side, I'm just seeing an increased need for resources to hire the right individuals, retain the right individuals, and further improve our resiliency from a cybersecurity standpoint. We can never keep pace with the private sector. I understand that. We have a duty to be careful with the privilege we have to serve and the resources we get from the American taxpayer. But I do think net we are a value add given the penalties we impose and the protections that we bring to markets, and because of that, I think it's important that we continue to invest in the CFTC, especially on the technology side, so we can build this resilience and not leave American financial markets vulnerable to cyber attacks.
All right. Well, thank you. And we'll stick with cybersecurity as we move forward, and I may be right out of time, but I will ask this question, and you can report back to our office on this, or your staff can follow up. But as you are aware, when an individual buys a digital asset, that asset is secured by whichever platform they use to make the purchase. This means that different platforms can be more secure than others and could be vulnerable to cyber attacks. Would it be beneficial to create some sort of framework to ensure that digital assets are secure across whichever platform consumers choose to use? And to follow up on that, is this something that is being discussed at the CFTC or within interagency working groups?
Cybersecurity is a significant portion and discussion point among the larger effort of the relevant financial regulators and the Treasury Department. We understand, and I understand very clearly, that within the context of digital assets, as we're approaching and understanding and learning about the technology that is the foundation of digital asset ecosystem, that cyber becomes a significant risk. And we're seeing that even, I think, a few days ago, there was another cyber attack which led to about $600 million of stolen digital assets. This will continue, and this, in my mind, is just another argument for a strong, thoughtful, very proactive regulatory structure around the digital asset space. And for me personally, as chair of the CFTC, ensuring we have the right tools, that we're thinking about cyber risks specific to the digital asset space as it may be distinguishable from traditional finance, learning and understanding those new elements of it and addressing them as best that we can.
Mr. Chairman, well done. Thank you very much for those answers. And Mr. Chairman of the committee, I yield back my remaining time.
Thank you. And now the gentlewoman from Washington, Ms. Schreier, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Chairman Benham. I'd like to focus on the many uncertainties that our farmers are facing and how the CFTC can help. Supply chain dysfunction made worse by the pandemic was first brought to my attention by hay and wheat growers in my district back in early 2020. And since then, I've been in frequent communication with growers and exporters around Washington's 8th District about the issues that they are facing. Costs and the availability of transportation, both domestic and export markets, continue to be a big challenge for wheat, cherry, apple, pear, and hay growers in my district. For example, some growers have said that the cost for a truck to the East Coast has more than doubled in the last year. Others say that the cost to move fruit to the port to be loaded for export costs as much as the entire trip to the destination country did in previous years. And as you know, Chairman Benham, we're experiencing unprecedented market volatility with severe weather events, trade disagreements, the pandemic, and supply chain issues disrupting normal operations. I have been hearing from growers in my district about the challenges of getting their crops to overseas markets due to supply chain disruption, and also due to really exploitative practices of foreign-owned shipping companies. And now in recent months, I'm hearing about supply chain on the other side with the rising cost of inputs like fertilizer as a result of similar struggles. And so I'm concerned about what that means for our farmers who have utilized the derivatives market to control price risk. So if I could take wheat, for example, Washington State produces close to half of the nation's soft white wheat. And I'd like to know what mechanisms are in place to protect these wheat growers participating in these markets to help them hedge and manage their risk.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I often say about the CFTC, and I think I may have said it earlier, we were once a part of USDA. We were once a part of the Farm Bill, our reauthorization. And as the chairman noted, we were spun off in 1975. But that should not dismiss the fact that our core responsibility and job, I think, in many respects, should be continually focused on America's farmers and ranchers. And with that, I think about all of the tools in the toolbox that USDA provides, whether it's crop insurance or the commodity title programs, and then the futures market. And this is what historically it has been, and it needs to continue to be, especially under my chairmanship. So I think in terms of what we can do to address some of the wheat growers in Washington is ensure that we're utilizing the tools we have within the agency, whether it's consumer education and outreach, and I would be happy to come to Washington and speak to some of your constituents to ensure that they know that the U.S. futures markets remain a viable, cost-effective risk management tool, a credible and fraud-free price discovery mechanism, so that as we see these volatile times, and whether the externality is a pandemic, a financial crisis, and now what we're dealing with in terms of a geopolitical crisis, that they can confidently rely on America's futures markets and the CFTC as its primary regulator, so that they can hedge and manage that price risk in these difficult times.
I really appreciate your attention to that. And I know that the wheat farmers in my district would love to have you come and hear their stories, in particular, as we look at fires, climate, and now more volatility in the wheat market due to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. So I look forward to staying in touch. I would love to host you in my district. My wheat growers would love to meet you. And I want to thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for putting this hearing together. I yield back.
Thank you. And now the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Cloud, is now recognized for 5 minutes. Is Mr. Cloud on? You may need to mute. Unmute.
Hello, hello.
There you go.
Can you hear me, Chairman?
Yes, I hear you now. Go right ahead.
Yeah, I can hear you as well. The CFTC has 5 advisory committees that were created to foster discussion and provide recommendations to the agency. The leadership and membership of the committees are drawn from industry. In 2020, the subcommittee of the CFTC Market Risk Advisory Committee released a draft report with proposed recommendations to financial regulators on steps they could take to address climate-related market risks. Because advisory committees and their subcommittees are industry-led entities, reports that they adopt are not agency or official government work product. Only if they are adopted by the full committee can they become formal recommendations for public stakeholders of the commission. In the case of the MRC, its charter requires that full MRAC membership vote to adopt any report drafted in its name. Yet despite having 2 meetings after publication of the committee report, the MRAC leadership never called for a vote to adopt the committee report, and now the subcommittee is inactive according to the CFTC website. Do you know why the MRAC membership never adopted the draft report prepared by the subcommittee?
Thanks, Congressman. I was the sponsor of the MRAC. I continue to be the sponsor of the MRAC. And my suspicion is now that we have new commissioners, I will probably give way to one of the new commissioners that sponsorship. That report, as you pointed out, was published in September of 2020. I mentioned earlier to one of your colleagues on the committee very clearly that that was not a CFTC report. That was the product of the advisory committee only. In terms of the vote for the final report, it was just a sequence of events that happened that was coincidental, quite frankly. But the report was finalized in September of 2020. The next meeting that we had on the calendar was, I believe, February of 2021. And by that time, I had become acting chairman of the CFTC and decided not to raise that report up for a full committee vote.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. And now we will have the gentleman from New York. Mr. Maloney is recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Maloney, you may want to check your mic.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
I apologize for the difficulty.
No problem.
And I thank our witness today. I just had a couple of quick questions about digital assets. I'm particularly interested in the chairman's view of how the principle-based regulations that CFTC imposed would work in this context, and what similarities exist between, say, the way CFTC is regulating, in general, and the current setup of digital asset exchanges that are, not regulated currently. If you could just talk to us about that for a minute, I'd be interested.
Thanks, Congressman. I've said this before, I think, a number of times in the past, but market structure and within the context of digital assets and the unregulated platforms, they're regulated at the state level, which certainly from a New York perspective. Pre-trade transparency and having equal, fair information flow between exchanges and users. The exchange itself, ideally you have a CLOBR, which is a central limit order book, essentially an orderly platform where we see bids and asks. And then post-trade reporting, ensuring settlement, and then ultimately custody. These are core elements and principles of any market, whether it's an equity market or a futures market. And I personally and strongly believe that there shouldn't be anything necessarily different in the context of digital assets. Obviously, the custody and settlement becomes a bit more complicated and new and novel because of the assets themselves, but we're looking towards some of those issues and thinking about it. To address your first point quickly on the principles-based, principles-based regulation has been at the CFTC for about 22 years. By and large, market participants have been very supportive of it because it allows for innovation and development that's not too restricted by a more check-the-box exercise. I would emphasize to you that it doesn't mean that we don't have areas of more prescriptive rulemaking and prescriptive oversight, whether it's around data or cyber or some core requirements. But there is a nice balance that principles-based regulation allows markets and market participants to be flexible within how they conduct their businesses, knowing that they have to achieve similar outcomes, but also allowing for that flexibility to support innovation, growth, and moving and evolving with markets, as we know, evolve very quickly because of any number of externalities.
Yeah, thank you for that. And if you would say a word also about one of the things that I'm interested in is the equitable component in these markets. There's a Harris poll that suggests that that 23% of African American and 17% of Hispanic Americans, compared to only 11% of white Americans, own cryptocurrency. And so as we approach the kind of consumer regulations and protections, how do we balance the concern about those, those protections with, without suffocating, the emerging technologies and the opportunities they provide for communities of color that have in some ways been more, more interested in this market segment than the majority community?
A great question, Congressman, and something that I think it's important that we peel back the onion, so to speak, right? Because I think the data suggests some very positive things, potentially low-income communities and individuals who are either historically underbanked or don't have access to banking services. And I think we can all agree, or at least some of us can agree, that this particular technology may allow for easier access to banking services and the transfer of assets. And that's a very positive and good thing, especially for low-income and historically underprivileged communities. But I would also say that we have to be very cautious, and you note this out rightfully so, that as we see these markets evolve, I can generally say that they're highly speculative and highly retail-oriented. So we need to make sure that folks are using, at this point where the market's largely unregulated, these services for the right reasons. And if they're not, and if they're more focused on the speculation side and just potentially making money on a short-term basis, I have a responsibility, other regulators have a responsibility to do exhaustive and extensive outreach to individuals in communities that we don't historically reach out to. And I've said this earlier, but it's important that we utilize the leverage and the tools we have at the CFTC to make sure people are aware of the risks, aware of the opportunities, but protecting themselves and their livelihoods from fraud, manipulation, and what has historically been the same type of fraudulent schemes we've seen throughout history. Ponzi schemes, pump and dumps. The asset might be different, but the fraud is largely the same, and we need to use that experience and that expertise to make sure we're rooting out those bad actors and protecting these communities.
Thank you very much.
I thank the gentleman and thank you for all your good work and for your testimony today. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And now the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Frenstra, is now recognized for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Scott and Ranking Member Thompson. The cattle industry is very important to my district and my state and even to my family. Iowa ranks amongst the highest producers in the cattle in the country, which has given me plenty of opportunity to sit down and talk about the issues that cattle producers feel important. Every time I meet with them, they always ask for true price discovery that will allow cattle producers sufficient leverage in cash negotiations. You mentioned in your testimony that the core purpose of the Commodity Exchange Act is the promotion of fair competition among Board of Trade and other markets and market participation. What steps is the CFTC taking to monitor transparency in the cattle cash markets to ensure fair and correct pricing?
Thanks, Congressman. An extremely important question, and I could say one that I've been focused on even as a commissioner, but I also do want to give credit to my predecessors. There have been many challenges, I think, in the evolution of technology in our markets and other components that have contributed to some of the issues and concerns that are being raised by livestock producers. We are very engaged with constituencies, both at the national level and the local level. We continue to obviously utilize our authorities from an enforcement perspective to ensure that markets are fair and free and transparent and free from fraud and manipulation. Obviously, the underlying market plays a key role in any futures market. So ensuring that the cash market on the livestock side is also transparent, open, and those data feeds that are coming to the boards of trade are readily available, and that those prices are reflecting what's happening in the cash market. So I'm happy to work with you and your constituents to ensure this. We understand how important the issue is. We did form a livestock task force a few years ago, and I'd be certainly welcome to doing something similar in the future if you have continuous concerns.
And I really appreciate that. And that's my next question. If you have any recommendations, and you sort of noted one, do you have any other recommendations? I mean, this in the Midwest is a very critical issue.
I think a few things is, one, I can get back to the folks who are on that task force and see if there's anything we can do to either resurrect it or start thinking about those issues and see if we're seeing any patterns. Two, the Agriculture Advisory Committee is one of the advisory committees, so perhaps we can use that advisory committee as a venue or vehicle to convene folks and start to talk about these issues.
Yep. Well, I greatly appreciate that, and I look forward to working with you on this.
Thank you.
Also, in your testimony, you mentioned how COVID-19 pandemic tested the resilience of the derivative markets and the post-financial crisis reforms. Obviously, we saw the Russia invasion has created a crisis surrounding wheat production. There's other events that are shocking the agricultural market, especially the cost of inputs, inflation, that are really hitting my producers in my district. Can you please elaborate on how derivative markets will help address the market disruptions in the turbulent environment that we have?
Thanks, Congressman. I think as long as I feel like I'm doing my job and the agency's doing its job, markets will remain free and from fraud and manipulation, which means they're properly reflecting supply-demand dynamics. But with that allows producers in Iowa to hedge risk out a curve, which can go years out, and stabilize those prices and eliminate those fluctuations that we're seeing in the short term. So this was the intentional purpose of the markets. This is what they've served. I have a responsibility to make sure that they're serving those core requirements and purposes. And as I mentioned to some of your colleagues, I certainly welcome the opportunity to do some outreach to your constituents to help them feel more confident and comfortable with our markets as another tool in the risk management toolbox.
Good, thank you. Just one final question. We talk so much about digital currency. It looks like it's going to cost about $100 million in your budget. That's about a third of your budget. How do you square that up? I mean, that's a big deal.
Yeah, it's not insignificant, and I take my responsibility as a steward of taxpayer resources very seriously. But in that number that I came up with, I used an example from the financial crisis and where our budget was before the financial crisis and where it was after, most notably in light of the fact that we had a huge increase in our authority over derivatives. That said, I can tell you in just the past year, we've brought in over $100 million, I believe, in penalties from fraud and manipulation. So I do look at our agency's purpose and mission in that context. If we're doing our job, we're making sure markets are free and fair and rooting out bad actors and making them accountable. And we're earning our paycheck in some respects, and we'll continue to do that. But that's why I think there's a value potentially for us to have this authority and protect markets and market participants.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. And now the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Lawson, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for having this meeting. Commission, I believe you're aware of the concerns aluminum end use have with aluminum pricing, particularly the application of the Midwest Premium, which has increased 450% since the implementation of the 232 tariff in 2018. Can you confirm whether your agency or any other regulatory agency have jurisdiction authorizing statutes over spot markets? And if not, can you share any thoughts on what the solution is to this regulatory gap? Whether my bill, HR 2698, the Apex Act, might be is the right approach?
Thanks, Congressman. We have jurisdiction over cash markets across commodities, when there is fraud and manipulation involved. That's a statutory authorized authority we have. But outside of fraud and manipulation, we do not have authority to police cash markets. We utilize that authority. We've utilized it in digital assets and other commodities over the years, and you can imagine the relationship between cash and futures and the importance of having cash markets that are free from fraud and manipulation. In regard to the Apex Act, thank you for your support. Thank you for your interest in this issue. Obviously, aluminum prices have gone up very significantly in the past few years. And a lot of inputs and externalities related to that, given the crisis in Ukraine, some supply chain constraints, a shoot up in demand and less supply. So obviously a number of things driving that price. But in terms of the Apex Act, I would say that that would be a pretty unique authority for us to have. We don't traditionally, and the way I view it is potentially register or have oversight over a price setting benchmarking agency or entity. As we think about it, and I'm happy to take a steer or input from you, those services are voluntary. So I think we would need to ensure that whatever authority Congress decides to provide to the CFTC in context of benchmarking benchmark providers is that we retain that service. Because if it's a voluntary service and then a regulator comes into the scheme, that voluntary service could easily go away, and then where are we left, potentially without a benchmark provider? So look forward to certainly talking to you about it more. I think it's a very positive step, but it would be a unique authority for us to have, and we'd have to think really hard from a CFTC perspective, what would the regulatory outcomes be, what rulemakings would be needed to implement your law?
Hey, thank you, and I look forward to working with you on that. And I want to note that in fiscal year 2021, Consolidated Appropriation Act passed December 2020. It included language directing your agency to release a public record on aluminum pricing. Commissioner, are you able to provide an update on how the report is progressing and when you expect to release it?
Thank you. We are in the process of working on a document that we could share that obviously reserves and preserves any confidentiality issues, but understand that request in the Appropriations Act, and we will get that up to you as soon as possible. I'll have my staff reach out to yours shortly after the hearing so that you can get a tighter timeline and date on when that report will be provided to Congress.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, for being here. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. And now the gentlelady from Florida, Mrs. Carmack, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to Chairman Benham for being here in front of the committee today. So many important topics that we want to make sure we cover, so I'm just going to jump right in. Chairman Benham, in your testimony to the Senate Ag Committee, you stated that there is, quote, a thin line that the CFTC and the SEC must navigate when determining which agency has jurisdictional authority over the digital asset space. Additionally, you clarified that 60% of the digital asset space marketplace falls under the jurisdictional authority of the CFTC, and that the CFTC is prepared to assume the role of the primary regulator for cryptocurrency and blockchain technology. So this is a very important issue to me as the millennial representing in Congress. This is something very important to my peer group and a very complicated issue. I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on Congress doing legislatively to ensure that the CFTC has spot market jurisdiction of the digital asset marketplace and doesn't fall into the purview of an overreaching SEC.
Thanks, Congresswoman. You point out all the things that I've said in the past and echo what you said about the importance of a regulatory structure. Right now, there's a lot of uncertainty in the market. From a CFTC perspective, our authority is very limited to police those markets. And as I said earlier, it is limited to fraud and manipulation in the commodity space. And as you point out, I think I mentioned 60%, and that number has stayed relatively the same. I think the market capitalization of digital assets tends to swing day by day, but in terms of the value of two core digital assets, Bitcoin and Ether, that is roughly in the 55 to 60% range of the total digital asset market capitalization. And at least Bitcoin has been determined to be a commodity by a federal court. I think Ether has not, but when you look at the asset itself, it looks like and tends to be more of a commodity than a security. I use that phrase thin line because this is really a balancing act and something that we need, I think, collectively support and guidance from Congress on as to how are we going to regulate the space, how are we going to protect customers, how are we going to ensure market resiliency, how are we going to prevent financial stability risks if the market continues to grow and scale at the clip that it is. But ultimately, and to speak to your support of the technology, whatever outcome may exist in 10 or 20 or 30 years with this technology, I'm a firm believer that American financial markets, both equity markets, security markets, and derivatives markets, are the best, deepest, and strongest in the world because of our regulatory structure, because there are clear rules of the road and bad actors are held accountable. And I think that same logic can be applied to the digital asset space. I can't predict what's going to happen. I think as a regulator, we want to assume it's going to continue to grow, and I have to protect customers and those core items about resiliency and stability. But in terms of innovation and development and growth in marketplace, I do think a regulatory structure would be helpful in supporting the growth of the market in the years to come, regardless of what may come from it from a technology perspective.
Well, and I appreciate your feedback. And at some point, because I certainly cannot in a minute and 40 seconds dive into the decentralized nature of what could be. So I'm going to just pivot here, and hopefully we can have a time to sit down and discuss further on this, and I'll have my office reach out to yours. But I do want to jump to a market stability question. Given recent events in Ukraine, I come from a heavily ag district. Farmers, ranchers, other commercial entities obviously rely on futures markets to hedge risk. And the Russian invasion of Ukraine has resulted, as you know, in extreme market volatility and record trading volume on global markets. Obviously, we're seeing fertilizer reach somewhere in the ballpark of 700% on some certain ones, particularly potash. Now, I want to know, how is CFTC approaching this from a surveillance standpoint?
Congresswoman, we are on heightened alert. We are making sure that we're understanding and identifying risks in the marketplace. We're looking at the cash market and seeing what we're seeing from a transportation standpoint, from a supply chain standpoint, and ensuring those supply-demand dynamics in the cash space are being properly reflected in the future space. As I pointed out, our core responsibility is obviously on derivatives markets. We have fraud and manipulation in cash markets, but if we can ensure that markets are fair, operating orderly, they're transparent, and that they're free from fraud and manipulation, that means they're reflecting cash supply-demand dynamics, and that means your constituents and other producers can hedge those risks and eliminate some of those extreme up and downs and continue to do their business as intended.
Well, and I know my time is about to expire. One last question, Mr. Chairman, if you would allow me to submit for the record so I may get a written response, I would be very much appreciative.
Thank you. And now we will hear from the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Miller, and she's recognized for 5 minutes. This will be our final witness for the day, our final member for the day. Ms. Miller, you're now recognized.
Thank you. Chairman Benham, I know that addressing climate-related market risk has been a priority for you during your tenure at the Commission. But what role does CFTC or derivatives products have in directly addressing climate change?
Congresswoman, I think, inherently our markets are risk management markets. Our markets have been thinking about data points related to climate for decades. That's really at the core of what our markets do, whether, it's a tornado, a rainstorm, or a fire. And I think right now my goal is to utilize the economists and the experts in the CFTC to engage with the private market to support innovation so that we can see new products and new development in the space that would help mitigate some of the impacts of physical climate change and also help support an orderly transition to a net zero economy.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. And now, before we adjourn, I want to invite our ranking member to share his closing remarks, and then I will come and give my closing remarks.
All right, Chairman, thank you very much. This was a great hearing. It was great to have Chairman Benham before us, and I appreciate his comments, his overview, his leadership of the Commodities Futures Trading Corporation, which, quite frankly, we have jurisdiction over, and functions based on principles. I will take the moment, kind of shameless plug, to encourage my colleagues to join me with the Digital Commodities Exchange Act. I think as you heard from the exchange today, that proposal, soon to be introduced piece of legislation, really is, I think it provides the tools that CFTC needs, the clarity, the definitions, the principles to be able to deal with this ever-increasing digital commodity market. It is, the United States has always been a leader with the first generation of Internet, which is the Internet of Knowledge, the second generation, which is the Internet of Things that we're kind of living through right now, and quite frankly, the third generation of technology is the Internet of Value, which allows these digital commodities to flourish. America has been a true leader, not a follower, for the first and second version, and we need to continue that for the Internet 3.0, and then this piece of legislation would provide us the tools to do that. So, Chairman Benham, thank you to you, to your leadership. We're excited to have you in this role. We're excited to have your new colleagues that will be joining you. We need to make sure that you have the resources that you need to be able to do the job that you have. And I think that includes, obviously, with this expanding digital commodity market, additional resources for the staff with expertise to make sure that America remains a leader. So thank you. And, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Well, thank you, Ranking Member. And Chairman Benham, all I can say is thank you for your articulate presentation, your knowledgeable presentation. We are very fortunate to have you as our new CFTC chairman. And I think I speak for our entire committee that we are very fortunate to have you here. And we look forward to helping you in any way that we can be helpful to your forward progress. I do want to leave you with this caveat, however. As you recall, I mentioned at the very beginning how I enlightened myself during my early days in the knowledge of one Alexander Hamilton. And the reason I want to mention that, our great first Treasury Secretary, was where would we be without the national banking system that he put together? The New York Stock Exchange Foundation, even our Federal Reserve. And George Washington thought so much of him that he not only made him his aide-de-camp, but his youngest cabinet member as Treasury Secretary. Where would we be if we did not take care and flourish those frameworks of our great financial system in this country? That's why I am registering with you the importance of doing the same care and tenderness that we have given to those other institutions that have helped us through the Revolutionary War. The national banking system did, all the way up through with the New York Stock Exchange, even paying our bills out of the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, the Depressions, all the way through. So now we're here with this other movement, cryptocurrency. It's new. So were derivatives and swaps. But these are the anchors, CME and ICE, that got us through that and manifested that in the same pattern as Alexander Hamilton's vision. So what I'm saying to you is, and you heard it from both Democrats and Republicans, we want to not risk losing the wealth of contribution and continuation of our great financial system, of the intermediaries in this. We got to keep ICE and CME strong, the way we've kept all of the other institutions historically that have kept our financial system as the greatest in the world. That's all we say. Take care of the bridge that has brought us through. And certainly ICE and CME have done that so much. So with that, I am now going to adjourn with these final comments. Under the rules of the committee, the record of today's hearing will remain open for 10 calendar days to receive additional material and supplementary written responses from the witness to any questions by any member. And now, before I adjourn, I want to thank our wonderful staff, headed up by Ann Simmons and Ashley Smith and Catherine. I call her Catherine the Great, my chief of staff. We all work together. Thank you all for this wonderful and very informative hearing. This meeting is now adjourned.